Hey guys, welcome back to Advanced Kids Online, where we're all about teaching children the heart of God, the Word of God, and the character of God. I hope that you've had an absolutely amazing week. We've just finished the second week of the school holidays. I hope that you did some absolutely amazing stuff with your family, here in Taupo celebrating winter at the Winterfest, and just doing so many amazing things. Over the last few weeks, remember, we've been in a series called Elected by God, and so far we've learned about Joshua and a few of the amazing judges that God used to rule over his people, the Israelites, and help them to make tough decisions and rescue them when they were in a few tough spots. Last week we learned about Samson. Before that we learned about Gideon, Deborah, and Ehud, some of the amazing judges that just did awesome things like superheroes for God. Why don't we jump in and continue to learn about some of the amazing people that God used throughout the Old Testament to help his people, the Israelites, go through life and the journey in figuring out how to follow God and be really great believers. Stay tuned, we're going to learn a little bit more going through some of the amazing people as well as the kings and queens that God elected through the Old Testament. So, the last judge that we learned about was Samson, the strong warrior that God used to help his people, the Israelites, through their journey of becoming really strong believers. Now, after Samson, there weren't many great judges. They sort of failed a little bit after that. They wouldn't really listen to God, and sometimes they started just doing bad things. So, we're going to talk about an amazing young boy who grew up to be a strong man and a prophet for God. This boy's name was Samuel. Now, Samuel was born to a woman named Hannah. Hannah couldn't have children for all of her life until God blessed her with a son, and his name was Samuel. Once she was blessed with that child, she knew that Samuel had to grow up in the ways of the Lord. So she sent him to live in the temple with a master prophet named Eli. Eli looked after Samuel his whole childhood. One night, Samuel was lying in bed and he heard a voice calling his name. So he ran out to Eli and said, "You said my name, I'm here." Eli said it wasn't me and told him to go back to sleep. This happened 3 times before Eli realized that it was the voice of God trying to talk to Samuel. So Samuel went back to get to bed and he said, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." From then on, Samuel became a prophet, and God downloaded amazing things, sometimes tough, but sometimes they rescued the people of Israel. Samuel was an absolutely amazing prophet and man who listened to God. The first thing he ever had to do was tell Eli, his master, the person who raised him, that God was no longer going to bless him because of the mistakes that he had made. Imagine how hard that would have been. Going on further in his life, Samuel was the one that God used to elect all of the kings. Samuel's sons were judges, but the Israelites came to Samuel and said, "Your sons are no good. They are not like you. We want a king." And from then on, Samuel was the one that God used to elect all of the kings in the line of Israel. Why don't we jump in and watch this video that's going to explain to you a little bit more about Samuel's story, what he was like, who he was, and what God had called him to. Make sure you pay attention, open your eyes and open your ears, and watch this video with some awesome information about Samuel.
God's story, Samuel. So part of God's story is about Samuel, and it goes like this. Samuel was a prophet, or a person who hears from God and shares God's messages with others. And everything God says is true. The first time Samuel heard from God, he was actually a kid. One night when Samuel was sleeping, he heard someone calling his name. This might have seemed really strange. So Samuel woke up and thought Eli, who lived in the same place, was calling for him. Samuel ran to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me?" But Eli said, "I did not call you. Go, lie back down." So Samuel lay back down. Then he heard his name again. He ran to Eli a second time and said, "Here I am. You called me?" And Eli said, again, "I did not call you. Go lie back down." This must have been really confusing. Samuel lay back down, and then it happened again. When he ran to Eli a third time, Eli thought it might be God who was talking to Samuel. Eli said, "Go and lie down. If someone calls out to you again, say, 'Speak, Lord, I'm listening.'" Samuel obeyed. When he heard someone say, "Samuel," he answered, "Speak, Lord, I'm listening." And you know what? It was God, and God had lots of things to say to Samuel. God told Samuel some difficult news that he had to deliver to Eli. Now, Eli was a priest, but had made some wrong choices, so God told Samuel that Eli wasn't going to be allowed to be a priest anymore. Samuel was scared because he was pretty sure Eli was going to get upset, but Samuel obeyed God anyway. At first, Eli was upset. But then Eli said, "He is the Lord. Let him do what he thinks is best." See, sometimes people don't like hearing what God has to say, but a prophet has to care more about what God says than what people say. When Samuel grew up, the Israelites asked him to pick someone to be their king. Samuel wasn't sure this was what God wanted, so he asked God about it. God said, "Tomorrow I will send a man to you. He is from the land of Benjamin. He is the one I have picked to be king of Israel." Sure enough, the next day, a tall, strong man came to Samuel. When Samuel looked at him, he heard God say, "He is the man I told you about. His name is Saul. He will rule over my people." Samuel heard what God told him to do, and he obeyed. Samuel anointed Saul as a symbol that God had picked him to be king. But Saul ended up being pretty selfish and making a lot of wrong choices. And when God said it was time to replace Saul with a new king, God sent Samuel to anoint a shepherd boy, the youngest and smallest of his brothers, named David. David also heard from God and obeyed, and David grew up to be the greatest king Israel ever had, until a long time later when a boy named Jesus was born. Even as a kid, Jesus showed people around him how to hear from God and obey. See, everyone can hear from God. Kids, grown-ups, kings, cowboys, moms, dads, mimes, teachers, astronauts, bird watchers, bird-watching mimes. Everyone. We can hear from him in the middle of the night when we're trying to sleep. Or we might hear something that surprises us. But we don't have to be a grown-up or a prophet or a king in order for God to notice us and for us to hear from him. It's like when God told Samuel, "The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." And that's a little about the story of Samuel. So in case you missed it, here's the quick version. Samuel was a boy who heard from God. God talked to him in the middle of the night. God told Samuel to make Saul a king. Later, God told Samuel to make David king. Samuel heard from God and obeyed. We can hear from God too, and that's a part of God's story.
So, Samuel was right at the very beginning of the Israelites' demands for a king and God's plan to restore a king. Do you know who that king might be? That was one day going to rescue all of his people. So, Samuel's story with the Israelites and the search for a king starts here in 1 Samuel 8 verse 5. It goes like this. "Look," they told him, "you are now old and your sons are not like you. Give us a king to judge us like all the other nations had." So the Israelites decided that God wasn't enough. That God wasn't enough of a king and a ruler and a judge over them, that they needed a man to stand in that place, because that's what all of the other nations had. They had a king to stand in front of them and tell them exactly what to do. So God said, okay, and he got Samuel to choose a king, which we're going to learn about next week. But isn't it absolutely amazing that Samuel was able to hear so clearly from God? Now, I know he wasn't a judge and he wasn't a king, but I believe he was elected by God to help the Israelites through their journey of going from judge to king, and to help God by being a voice on earth for him. Isn't that absolutely amazing? Well, I hope that you've learnt so much in the last couple of weeks of our series, Elected by God. I hope that you're holding on to that information because remember, knowledge is power. And when we know things, there the light will be. And where the light is, there can't be any darkness. So the more we know, the more we can fight against our enemy, the devil, and be really strong believers in the faith that believe in Jesus and know that God has a freedom purpose for our life. I hope that you have an absolutely amazing first week back at school, and we will see you next week for another episode of Advanced Kids in our series Elected by God, part of our 2022 series, God's Freedom Timeline. See you later, everybody.